So good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to introduce Tori Bruno, who is our keynote speaker for this afternoon. Tori is the President and Chief Executive Officer for the United Launch Alliance. In this role, he serves as the principal strategic leader of the organization and oversees all business management and operations. I also have the distinct pleasure of serving with Tori as a member of the National Space Council User Advisory Group, which is chaired by Vice President Pence. When America last went to the moon, we did so mostly to beat the Soviets. This time, we're going to stay. Tori will be sharing his vision today about how markets will ensure sustained interest in the lunar region and explore how best to align the private sector's goals with that of various government agencies. Tori is truly a visionary, and I look forward to hearing his thoughts today on this national imperative. Tori.
Thank you. That was very nice. Thank you. Good afternoon. All right, so I am going to talk about going back to the moon, staying on the moon, and how that infrastructure is going to help stimulate what will become a multi-trillion-dollar-a-year economy in cislunar space and ultimately lead us on a path towards a post-scarcity human future. If you would go to the next slide, please. But first, I'm a rocket guy, so I brought a rocket video. We have to have smoke and fire.
Spacecraft separation.
All right. So first I'd like to just do a context setting by recapping humanity's exploration of the moon. So this is, on this chart, all of our trips to the moon. On the top, where the dots are in space, each dot is a visit, and that is in orbit. And then down on the bottom, where the dots appear on the surface of the moon, that's a trip to the surface. So you can see the great flurry of activity back in the 1960s, extending into the 70s, and the big yellow text where humans walked on the moon in the Apollo program, and then 14 years of absolutely nothing. Go to the next slide, please. And finally, 33 years before we went back to the surface of the moon. Now I want to back up and say something about the prior one, if you wouldn't mind backing up for a second. Going back to the moon with L-Cross is part of my favorite pair of missions to the moon that history is going to look back upon as truly an important moment in our history. Above that is the Chandrayaan Indian satellite that orbited the moon and detected the constituents of water and led us to believe perhaps there could be water on the moon. And directly below that you see L-Cross, which was a mission where we took an Atlas Centaur to the moon and deliberately crashed it onto the lunar surface into a crater, deeply shadowed, throwing ejecta up above the lunar surface that could be observed by its satellite, and confirmed that the Indian satellite was correct and there was in fact water. One of the great discoveries of our time that is going to enable our human future in cislunar space, which I'll come back to a little bit later. Okay, go forward. So 33 years before we touched, even with a robotic machine, the surface of the moon. Go to the next slide. And how long before we have human beings walking on the moon? It'll be 52 years in 2024 when the next man and first woman walk on the moon. I think you would agree with me that it's going to be about damn time. All right, go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to take a moment and talk about the program that is carrying us back there. And I've dissected some of these NASA charts a little bit. NASA will hopefully forgive me to make it a little bit more accessible to people. So I'm going to start first with a typical trip to the moon after everything is in place. So we start on a super heavy lift vehicle, the SLS, with an Orion atop. Now that capsule can carry 4 to 6 human beings. It has a European service module beneath it. They're not going to the moon this time only to plant a flag and walk around. There will be important research missions done on the moon, and there'll be more than one of them. So there'll also be specialized equipment. This is a very heavy payload, and that's why it's going to ride on an SLS. So they'll fly out. The Orion will continue once it's dropped off by the rocket. It will rendezvous with the Gateway, which is a space station orbiting the moon. The astronauts will disembark. Some of them perhaps will stay behind and operate robotic devices on the moon doing research. Perhaps others will board their vehicle that will take them down to the lunar surface and come back. And I'm going to pause here for a moment because I want to talk about this notion of robotics or autonomous systems versus human beings in this new exploration of the moon, because in some circles there's a little bit of debate about should it be this way or should it be that way. And there are people who are not entirely understanding what this is about. And I'll put to you that that's actually a silly argument to have. There will be people in space and there will be people on the moon. But for a long time to come, people will be rare. They will be scarce. And so they have to be placed really on only the most important and difficult tasks, and other tasks to be left for robots and automation. The other thing that you should appreciate is that space is a really difficult place to work. In our many years, 20 years now of continuous human presence in space on the International Space Station has taught us that the productivity of a person working in space is much lower than the productivity of a person working down here in an air-conditioned environment on Earth with 1 g of gravity. And so even the people that are there are going to need automation to help them be productive and to accomplish these tasks. So don't debate it. This is how it's going to work. So back to our story. So the astronauts are in the Gateway, and some of them get into their vehicle to take them down to the lunar surface, which you see at the top part of the page there. And so they'll get in that descender, if you will, and then that module that you see on the back is called a transfer vehicle. That's a propulsion unit that will take them from our high lunar orbit, that in this case happens to be what's called a near rectilinear halo orbit. That name isn't important in general. That's simply a convenient place to have this Gateway space station. So they'll descend from that down to low lunar orbit. Then they will coast around until they're aligned for their insertion down to where they want to be on the surface, and the descender will take them down. They will disembark, do their job. That might be hours, it might be days. Eventually, it will surely be weeks. Then they will get back into their vehicle, and the descender part will be left there on the surface, and the ascender will bring them back to the Gateway space station, where they can then get into the Orion capsule when they're all done with their duties on that station, on Gateway, and be carried 3 days back to the Earth. So that's how a typical mission will go. Actually, not that complicated. Go to the next slide. All right, let's talk about building that infrastructure. That is significant infrastructure. So the heavier pieces of the Gateway are going to be brought up by the SLS vehicle, as well as the people that will be involved in Orion in the capsule. And then there will be a whole series of commercial launch vehicles that will bring up parts and pieces and propellant and logistic supplies and food and water and air and all that other material. So Artemis Gateway will be assembled by a team of government and private contractors that will come together, not just from the United States, but from all around the world, to put together this great human endeavor of a permanent presence and infrastructure in lunar orbit and on the lunar surface. And when that happens, there will be infrastructure in place that will allow us to extend into commercial activities in the future that I have described in a moment. This will make it possible, for example, to have an industrial scale ice mine on the lunar surface and refinery that will allow us to have propellant there on the moon that will make traveling through cislunar space so much more practical, but I will come back to that in a moment. So that is the Artemis Gateway infrastructure and the architecture for putting it all together. Go to the next slide, please. Why might we want to have all of this commercial activity I keep talking about, and why would we want to leverage this NASA exploration program to make that happen? Well, as it turns out, there's a tremendous amount of natural resources on the lunar surface and on the near-Earth objects, or the asteroids, that are near, whose orbits bring them near the moon and are an easy travel distance from the moon. In fact, it is far more resources than we had ever dreamed might be there. So there's about 17,000 of these near-Earth objects, and they contain, our estimates, about 2 trillion kilograms of industrial metals. Titanium, aluminum, iron, nickel, cobalt, so on. In addition to that, we think there's over 150 metric tons of precious metals, 150 metric tons of gold and silver and platinum and so on. Now, what does that mean? These are giant numbers. It's hard to relate to them. Well, there are more industrial metals on the moon and on those bodies than about 1,000 times the Earth's entire planetary production of those materials. More precious metals that have been extracted by the Earth by human beings in the last 40,000 years. This is tremendous wealth. All of the things, many of the things, that are rare here on Earth are not actually rare in the universe. They're difficult for us to get to here because of the way our planet formed, due to its very deep gravity well, drove those materials, mostly by virtue of their density, below the surface and far out of reach, making them scarce up here where we were able to access them. But on these bodies, because they have very little gravity, they're essentially sitting on the surface, easily accessible, if only we had a practical transportation system that will allow us to go there and tap into these resources. Go to the next slide, please. Well, let's talk about the great discovery of our time, that water is everywhere. In particular, we now believe there's about 20 billion metric tons of water on the moon at the poles. Water is the crude oil, ice is the crude oil of cislunar space. It is easily converted into liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, the most energetic chemical propellants practically available today. In fact, the most likely way that it will be done is with a simple process called electrolysis that many of you did when you were high school students taking chemistry. You pass an electrical current through water and it readily disassociates into those two gases. Now you might say, wow, another big number. What does this mean to me? 20 billion metric tons. Are we just going to burn through this crude oil and be facing a scarcity of the equivalent to fossil fuels in space? Well, eventually, at the current demand for space travel around Earth, this would be about 100 million years worth. Now, granted, we're going to have this giant trillion-dollar economy growing out in space. Let's say that increases our demand by 100-fold. I guess in about 1 million years, we're going to hope to travel beyond cislunar space to the next deposit. So I think we're set for quite a while. Go to the next slide. Let's talk about some of the other economic activities besides mining and precious metals. There are materials that you can make in microgravity that you cannot practically make here. Very pure materials like fiber optics, very delicate and precise additive manufacturing of structures like human tissues that simply can't be made here. And of course, radiation and other things, even tourism, are things that are unique to the environment of space that provide potential economic value. I mean, imagine a person with heart disease that could have a heart fabricated for them from their own tissue, compatible with their body in space to save their life. Or lungs for someone with chronic, respiratory disease. That's just the beginning. Go to the next slide. And finally, ultimately, the potential to fabricate structures and systems in space from materials that we sourced in space. When we do that, there's no real practical limit to the size, and the cost is of course collapsed by the presence of propellants in space by at least a factor of 10. One of the most exciting applications that will eventually come as this infrastructure has expanded will be power generation in space, solar power generation. The problem with solar on Earth is our atmosphere. Thank God our atmosphere takes out 90% of the energy that impinges upon the Earth, or we'd all be sort of crispy. But in space, there is no night, there is no day, it's always day. There are no clouds, there is no atmosphere. The power density on average is more than a factor of 10 greater. We could create orbiting solar collectors. We will transmit that power to the surface of the Earth. Imagine what that will mean. Inexpensive, ubiquitous energy placed anywhere on the planet. It will change fundamentally what it means to be a human being. All of this enabled by where we are today, our first steps at putting permanent infrastructure in cislunar space through NASA's Artemis Gateway program that we will build beyond to make all of this happen. Go to the next slide, please. There are many entrepreneurs who are excited about this future, who think about this the same way that I do. We've brought together about 200 companies and universities in something we call the Lunar Marketplace. And we gather together once or twice a year and we do workshops and we create reports and we work on business models. This is a small sampling of some of our partners in this. And when this is present in the next decade, you will see many of these companies take off and begin this great economy I've described. Go to the next slide. Now, I want to talk about some of the things that make this challenging and some of the things that are going to make this possible. And the first thing I want to talk about are the vast distances of space. You've heard people say that. You've heard people say space is vast. It's difficult to relate to what that means. There is absolutely nothing in our daily human existence down here on Earth or in our evolutionary history which prepares us to truly comprehend just how vast space is. So let me start here with just the local neighborhood, Earth orbit. This sketch is to scale. So there's Earth. There's a typical LEO orbit at 1,000 nautical miles, 2,000 kilometers. That's about the distance from here to Miami. We can sort of get our head around that pretty easily. Lots of activities in LEO. Great for Earth observation, great for low latency communications. You go around the Earth very quickly. Every 90 minutes you circumnavigate the globe. While the globe can spin underneath you, if you're in a polar orbit, you can map the whole world. It's great for weather. The next place that we often talk about is geosynchronous orbit or geo-orbit, a little bit further out, about 22 times further out, 22,000 nautical miles, 36,000 kilometers, roughly equivalent to the circumference of the Earth. Quite a bit farther out. And you cannot, of course, travel from the surface of the Earth in a straight line, 22,000 nautical miles, out to geo. Everything is in orbit. You and I are in orbit right now. We're in orbit about the galactic center. We're in orbit about the sun. We are orbiting Earth very poorly with suborbital velocity. But we're always in orbit. And so when we want to go from the Earth out to geo, we take likely what's called a transfer or even a Hohmann transfer orbit, and it's a big sweeping arc that swings out and intersects with that orbit. So typically, the distance you transit to get from here to there is about twice that. So you'll actually go more like 40 or 50,000 nautical miles to get out there. Now we're going to stay in scale, but we're going to zoom out. Let's zoom out a step. Out to the moon. All right. 22,000 miles becomes 230,000 nautical miles. Almost 400,000 kilometers out to the moon. Factor of 10, factor of a lot. So think about that big sweeping arc, where now we're talking about, 400,000 or 500,000, 500,000 nautical miles of transit distance. It takes you maybe 15 minutes to get to Leo at the tremendous velocities that we travel when we go to orbit. 5 hours at least to get out to Geo, 3 days or more to get out to the moon. That is a vast, vast distance. Now these distances scale very quickly when we talk about the solar system. Let's again stay in scale. Let's zoom out to one of our popular destinations, Mars. 250 million miles, over 400 million kilometers. You're probably going to transit something like 1 billion miles in a typical transfer to get out from Earth to the Mars. You look way to the left, you can't see Leo or Geo anymore. Really at this scale, you can't see the moon. We just put that dot there just to keep you grounded in what we're talking about. Vast distances that matter for exactly 3 things. They matter for how long it takes you to transit. This is a 6-month trip as a minimum. Practical. They matter for keeping people alive during that trip. When we go to Mars, we're not just going to have to feed them and give them water and give them air for the 6 months out, the 6 months back. That's a year in travel time. We're not going to stay on Mars for 2 days after all of that. We're going to be there a while. So you got to do all of that. But also, and a bigger challenge, is that we're going to expose them to extraordinarily high levels of radiation during that trip. The ISS lives inside our ionosphere, and although they are outside the atmosphere, which gives us protection here on Earth, they give pretty high levels of radiation on the space station. That steps up probably another order of magnitude, depending on solar weather or more, during this trip out to Mars. So big challenge associated with these vast, vast distances. However, these distances do not matter at all for the amount of energy it takes to go from one place to another, which means the cost. So while the distances matter for transit times, they do not matter for what it costs to travel through space. Now we're scaling all of that to delta V, which is how we measure the energy to travel. Same thing, this is still in scale, but look what happened. Everything crashed together. It takes something like 20.5 kilometers per second, that's how we measure it. You can see the dashes on the screen, to get from Earth to the surface of Mars. Just getting to Leo is almost half of that. It's only about twice as far to the surface of Mars as it is to go to Leo, just a little bit more than twice. And then look where the moon is. The moon's practically on top of Mars. And L1, the Earth-Moon Lagrange point 1, a convenient transportation node, good gosh, that's almost 2/3 of the way, 3/4 of the way there, very close to the moon. The moon is literally on the way to Mars, not just because we need a gateway station to do research on prolonged exposure to microgravity and intense radiation, but it is quite literally in energy space and delta V space, practically to Mars already. Go one more slide, because I think we dropped a line on there to just, in case you can't read it in the back, that red line is Geo. Look where Geo is. You're practically to Mars already. And of course, from the gateway, which will be sitting at the high lunar orbit, the near rectilinear halo orbit, you can see how close you are to a near-Earth object where all of this tremendous wealth exists. as well as the surface of the moon itself. And by putting this infrastructure in place for Artemis and Gateway to explore the moon, we enable our ability to put the industry on the moon, to tap into the ice that is there and refine it into propellant, to make travel between these nodes practical. This is why discovering water on the moon with India's satellite, in our Centaur, in our satellite, is truly the great discovery of our time. Go to the next slide, please. All right, so as excited as I am about ULA's record of 135 launches, never failed to take our payload to space, all of that in my mind pales in comparison to the future that is now within our grasp. We're going to follow through with Artemis. We're going to put people back on the moon permanently, and then we're going to use that platform to extend industrialization of the moon in cislunar space to enjoy this future for our children and our grandchildren. Next slide. And with that, I am prepared for your questions if you have any. Anybody got a question? A shy group. Oh, I see a hand. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, the question for those of you who couldn't hear it is, how long will it take for a market for lunar propellant to develop? So let's walk through the timeline. So we're back on the moon for the first time, beginning our research, beginning all of our activities in 2024. Then we're going to spend a few years understanding the moon, surveying the moon. In parallel, it's not just Artemis Gateway. There's the CLIPS program and all these other commercial programs to do research and payloads on the moon. About 5 to 10 years after that, we're going to have our first practical industrial scale ice mine and refinery on the moon, which will begin generating propellant, which will then be available for resale on the lunar surface. So now we're talking about, say, 10 years from now is when that all starts, and then from there it grows. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Okay, microphone coming this time. How much time do I have? You better have a good question, because you're the last one.
We see the nice Vulcan panels out there, the nice BE4 sitting there. How's Centaur 5 coming?
Centaur 5 is coming great. So what you're referring to, what our guest is referring to, our colleague, is our booth down on the exhibit floor, where we have a panel from the new Vulcan rocker's main booster propellant tank. The actual flight panels are in the factory right now being fabricated, just like the one you saw. And then the question was, well, what about the upper stage, Centaur 5? So Centaur 5 is just building Pathfinder hardware now. We've built an entirely new line to fabricate Centaur 5. We're still building Centaur 3 for a couple more years. Centaur 5 carries 3 times as much propellant. It is a gigantic upper stage. And so this afforded us an opportunity to create a whole new production line. We actually went to the automotive industry, where the latest in industrial scale robotics is happening, and brought contractors in as our partners, and we've established 9 stations in our factory of these robotic welders. I mean, the Centaur, you want to appreciate, today is the highest performance upper stage in the world. It is 90% propellant when it is sitting on the pad. That is a sort of an unprecedented mass fraction, fully loaded. Its walls are half the thickness of a dime. It's like a soda can. It would collapse under its own weight if it were not fueled and pressurized. But it is built by hand. It has 180,000 welds, which are set up by hand and controlled by hand. It takes a long time to build one. There's a lot of craftsmanship. Centaur 5 will be completely robotically manufactured. And the robots that build it have the inspection, the NDE we call it, built right into them. So they're going to get built in half the time, more consistently, and with much higher quality. So all of those robots are on the factory floor. and we're building samples right now to get the robots tuned in. And in just a few weeks, we'll start building the first flight Centaur as well. Am I out of time? Can I take one more? Oh, no, I'm being told no. Okay, well, thank you all for coming.